Hi everyone, today I have compiled Home Alone stories that will scare you a lot. Let's move on to the video. The old Victorian house stood at the end of the winding road, shrouded in darkness as the moon peeked through the heavy clouds. Sarah had just moved in, eager to start fresh in her new home after the recent passing of her husband. With no family or friends nearby, she found solace in the quietude of the house, hoping it would bring her peace in her time of grief. As night fell, Sarah lit a few candles and settled into her favorite armchair by the fireplace, lost in her thoughts. The crackling fire provided a comforting warmth, but the eerie silence of the house sent shivers down her spine. She brushed it off as her imagination, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of her surroundings. Hours passed, and Sarah decided it was time for bed. She climbed the creaky staircase, each step echoing through the empty halls. The only sound accompanying her was the faint whisper of the wind outside. She reached her bedroom and slipped under the covers, pulling them tightly around her. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard it. A soft tapping noise coming from the other end of the hallway. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling, but the tapping grew louder, more persistent. Curiosity getting the better of her, Sarah reluctantly got out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. The tapping led her to a closed door she hadn't noticed before. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, the hinges squeaking in protest. What she found inside sent a chill down her spine, a small, dimly lit room filled with antique dolls. Sarah's heart raced as she took in the sight. The dolls seemed almost lifelike in the flickering candlelight, their glassy eyes staring back at her with an unsettling intensity. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she turned to leave, she heard a voice, a soft, childlike whisper coming from behind her. "Play with us, Sarah," it said, sending a wave of terror through her body. She spun around, but the room was empty, the dolls motionless on their shelves. Panic rising within her, Sarah fled the room and slammed the door shut, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled back to her bedroom, where she huddled under the covers, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to move. The night dragged on, each passing hour feeling like an eternity. Every creak, every whisper of the wind sent her heart racing, her mind consumed by fear. She was no longer alone in the house, she could feel it. A presence lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. As dawn broke and the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, Sarah dared to venture out of her room. The hallway was silent, the tapping long gone. She made her way downstairs, her nerves still on edge. But as she reached the bottom of the staircase, she froze. A small porcelain doll lay at the foot of the stairs, its delicate features twisted into a sinister grin. And written in a childlike scrawl on a nearby piece of paper were two words that made her blood run cold: "We're waiting." The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting long shadows across the empty hallway. Sarah stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase, her eyes fixed on the sinister doll at her feet. Fear gripped her heart like icy fingers, paralyzing her in place. With trembling hands, she reached down and picked up the doll, its porcelain skin cold to the touch. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried a weight beyond its small frame. Sarah's mind raced with questions. How had it gotten there? Who had left it for her, and most importantly, why? As she turned the doll over in her hands, she noticed something strange, a small keyhole hidden in its back. It was unlike any doll she had ever seen, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than met the eye. With a sense of trepidation, she slipped the doll into her pocket and made her way to the kitchen. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind like a haunting melody, each moment etched into her memory with terrifying clarity. The voice, the dolls, the sense of being watched, it all seemed too surreal, too impossible to be true. And yet she couldn't deny the palpable sense of dread that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah set about exploring every inch of the house, searching for any clues that might explain the strange occurrences. She checked every room, every corner, every hidden nook and cranny, but found nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if the events of the previous night had never happened, as if she had imagined it all, but deep down she knew better. There was something in this house, something sinister and malevolent, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the doll she now clutched in her hand. As the day wore on, Sarah's sense of unease only grew stronger. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind seemed to whisper of impending danger. She tried to push the thoughts from her mind, to convince herself that it was all just a figment of her imagination. But the fear gnawed at her insides like a hungry beast. Night fell once again, casting the house into darkness. Sarah lit a few candles and retreated to her bedroom, the doll still clutched tightly in her hand. She couldn't explain why, but she felt an inexplicable connection to it, as if it held the key to unraveling the mystery that surrounded her. Hours passed in tense silence, the ticking of the clock echoing through the empty house. Sarah lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting, watching, listening for any sign of danger. But as the minutes turned to hours and the night stretched on, nothing happened. The house remained still, as if holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. And then, just as Sarah's eyelids began to grow heavy with exhaustion, she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps coming from the hallway outside her door. Her heart leaped into her throat as she sat up in bed, her senses on high alert. The footsteps drew closer, closer, until they were right outside her door. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it, her breath caught in her throat. But when she opened the door, there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. Confusion and fear warred within her as she stepped out into the hallway, her eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. But the house was silent, the only sound the pounding of her own heart in her ears. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light coming from the end of the hallway. With a sense of dread creeping over her, Sarah followed the light, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. It led her to the closed door she had discovered the night before, the one that housed the collection of eerie. In the quiet suburbs of a small town, there stood an old house at the end of the street. Its windows were boarded up, and the once vibrant paint had faded into a ghostly gray. Inside this house lived a man named Samuel. He was a recluse, rarely seen venturing out into the world beyond his doorstep. Samuel had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. Rumors swirled about his past. Some said he was a war veteran haunted by the memories of battle, while others whispered of a tragic love lost long ago. But regardless of the stories, one thing was certain. Samuel was a man of solitude, content to spend his days and nights within the confines of his dilapidated home. As the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Samuel would retreat into the darkness of his house. The creaking floorboards and whispering winds became his only companions, their eerie symphony lulling him into a fitful sleep. Yet, despite his solitary existence, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was never truly alone. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and strange noises echoed through the empty halls. He dismissed them as figments of his imagination, the product of a mind grown accustomed to solitude. One night, however, as Samuel lay in bed listening to the symphony of the night, he heard something that chilled him to the bone. a soft, rasping voice calling out his name from the darkness. His heart pounding in his chest, he leaped out of bed and fumbled for the nearest source of light. But try as he might, the darkness seemed to swallow the feeble glow of his flashlight, leaving him stranded in a sea of shadows. The voice grew louder, closer, until Samuel could feel its icy breath on his neck. With a trembling hand, he reached out and flicked on the overhead light. What he saw in that moment would haunt him until the end of his days. Standing before him, bathed in the harsh glare of the light, was a figure cloaked in darkness. Its features were twisted and grotesque, a mockery of humanity, and in its eyes burned a hunger that sent a shiver down Samuel's spine. Without a word, the figure reached out its hand, beckoning Samuel to follow. Paralyzed with fear, he could do nothing but stare into those abyssal eyes as they bore into his soul. And then, with a voice like the rumble of thunder, it spoke. "Come with me, Samuel." It whispered, its voice a symphony of malice and deceit. "Come with me, and all your loneliness will vanish." In that moment, Samuel knew he had a choice to make. He could stay in the safety of his crumbling home, alone but free, or he could follow the figure into the unknown, where darkness lurked at every turn. With a trembling hand, he reached out and took a step forward, his fate sealed by the promise of companionship in the cold embrace of the night. And as he crossed the threshold into darkness, the world outside faded away, leaving Samuel alone with his newfound companion, forever lost in the depths of his own solitude. As Samuel ventured further into the darkness, the world around him seemed to warp and twist, as if reality itself were unraveling at the seams. Shadows danced and flickered, taking on grotesque shapes that sent shivers down his spine. With each step he took, Samuel felt a weight pressing down on him, a heavy burden of regret and despair that threatened to consume him whole. Yet still he pressed on, drawn ever deeper into the labyrinthine depths of the unknown. As time lost all meaning and space folded in on itself, Samuel found himself standing in a vast chamber, its walls adorned with strange symbols and sigils that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal upon which rested a single flickering flame. Mesmerized by its dancing light, Samuel approached the pedestal, his footsteps echoing through the chamber like the tolling of a funeral bell. With a trembling hand, he reached out to touch the flame, only to recoil as it burned with an intensity that seared his flesh. But even as the pain coursed through his veins, Samuel felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. Memories long buried rose to the surface of his mind, each one a shard of the fractured puzzle that was his life. And with each memory, he felt the weight of his loneliness grow lighter, as if the darkness itself were being driven back by the light of truth. In that moment, Samuel understood the true nature of his companion, the figure cloaked in darkness, the voice that whispered sweet promises of companionship in the dead of night. It was not a friend, nor even a foe, but a reflection of his own inner demons, a manifestation of the loneliness and despair that had consumed him for so long. With a newfound resolve, Samuel turned away from the flame and faced the darkness that surrounded him. No longer afraid, no longer alone, he embraced the shadows as a part of himself, a reminder of the struggles he had faced and the strength he had gained. And as he stepped out of the chamber and back into the world beyond, Samuel knew that his journey was far from over. But with each step he took, he walked with purpose, knowing that no matter what trials lay ahead, he would never again be lost in the depths of his own solitude. In the heart of a secluded forest, nestled among towering pines and whispering birches, there stood a solitary cabin. Its weathered exterior bore the scars of time, yet within its walls lay a haven of warmth and solitude for its sole inhabitant, Emily. Emily had sought refuge in the solitude of the forest after a bitter divorce left her broken and adrift. With only her faithful dog, Shadow, for company, she had retreated from the world, seeking solace in the embrace of nature. Yet, despite the tranquility of her surroundings, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. Strange noises echoed through the trees at night, and shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of her flickering lantern. One stormy evening, as Emily huddled by the fireplace with Shadow curled at her feet, a knock echoed through the cabin, sending shivers down her spine. With a trembling hand, she reached for the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she opened it, there was no one there. Only the howling wind and the distant rumble of thunder greeted her. Emily shook her head, chiding herself for her overactive imagination, and closed the door with a sigh. As the night wore on, however, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Shadows flickered and danced along the walls, their movements fluid and sinuous. And then, just as Emily was about to retire to bed, she heard it, a low guttural growl emanating from the darkness outside. Shadow tensed at her side, his hackles raised as he stared into the inky blackness beyond the window. Emily's heart raced as she grabbed a lantern and ventured outside, her dog at her heels. But when she stepped into the night, she found nothing but empty darkness. The growling had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. Emily scanned the forest, her lantern casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the darkness. And then, just as she was about to return to the safety of her cabin, she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the shadows. They gleamed with a feral intensity, their gaze locking with hers in a silent challenge. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Emily realized that she was not alone in the forest. Something lurked in the darkness, something primal and dangerous, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. With a sense of dread creeping over her, Emily turned and fled back to the safety of her cabin, Shadow hot on her heels. But even as she barred the door and huddled by the fireplace, she knew that the creature outside would not rest until it had claimed its prey. As the night wore on, the cabin was filled with the sound of scratching and scraping, as if something were trying to claw its way inside. Emily clutched Shadow close, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for the inevitable. And then, just as dawn began to break, the noises ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. Emily cautiously approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. But when she opened it, there was nothing there. No sign of the creature that had haunted her dreams, no trace of the terror that had gripped her heart. Only the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze greeted her, a stark contrast to the horrors of the night. With a sigh of relief, Emily stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight warming her skin as she gazed out into the forest. And as she looked down at Shadow, who sat faithfully at her side, she knew that whatever had lurked in the darkness, she would face it together with her loyal companion by her side. For in the heart of the forest, where shadows danced and nightmares roamed, there was no greater comfort than the bond between a woman and her dog. As the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. The incident with the mysterious creature had left her on edge, her nerves frayed by the constant sense of being watched. But despite her fears, she refused to let it drive her from the safety of her home. Each night, as darkness fell over the forest, Emily would huddle by the fireplace with Shadow at her side, listening to the sounds of the night with a mixture of dread and anticipation. And each night she would catch glimpses of movement outside the window, shadows flitting through the trees like phantoms in the night. But try as she might, Emily could never catch more than a fleeting glimpse of whatever lurked in the darkness. It seemed to move with an otherworldly grace, slipping through the trees like a wraith in the night. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's sense of isolation only grew stronger. She found herself spending more and more time within the confines of her cabin, venturing outside only when absolutely necessary. Even Shadow seemed to sense the change in her demeanor, his once playful demeanor replaced by a wary watchfulness. Then, one fateful night, as Emily lay awake in bed listening to the symphony of the forest, she heard it, the sound of scratching at the door. Her heart skipped a beat as she sat up, her eyes darting to the window where shadows danced in the moonlight. With a trembling hand, Emily reached for the lantern on her bedside table and crept towards the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could hear Shadow growling softly at her side, his fur bristling with tension. As she reached for the door handle, a sudden sense of dread washed over her, freezing her in place. What if whatever was outside was not some wild animal, but something far more sinister? What if it was the same creature that had haunted her dreams for so many nights? But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, Emily knew she had to face whatever lay beyond the door. With a deep breath, she flung it open, the light from her lantern cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. And there, standing on the threshold, was the creature she had feared for so long. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, their gaze locking with hers in a silent challenge. But instead of the feral intensity she had expected, there was something else lurking within them, something almost human. With a sense of disbelief, Emily stepped back, her mind reeling with the implications of what she was seeing. Could it be possible that the creature outside was not some malevolent force, but a lost soul searching for a home? As if sensing her hesitation, the creature took a tentative step forward, its movements slow and cautious. And then, with a voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind, it spoke.